my friends are synths.
This charming wee device is the Noodlebox. It's a serendipity sequencer that's been specifically designed with Eurorack in mind. It comes from a small company called 64 Pixels, who I think are based down in England, and you might recognise the design of this top section, and that's because 64 Pixels are the people that are behind that very popular CV-OCD module, which lets you convert DIN MIDI to CV and gate signals, and this kind of builds on that legacy and takes it quite a bit further. I personally came across the Noodlebox when I was looking through the Signal Sounds website. They're this specialist synth shop that's based here in Glasgow where I'm from, and they've always got these really interesting and unusual devices from boutique manufacturers like this. So if you're into that kind of thing, then I heartily recommend checking out their website, because they do ship all over the world. They have also been rumoured to include haggis in orders if people request that. So, I don't know why you would want haggis, but anyway, when I saw this, I knew I had to buy it, because I am a real sucker for alternative methods of sequencing. So anything that's a bit unusual, like the monome, or maybe the tenori on, or the Linstrument, or anything like that, anything that helps me think differently about how I interact with my electronic synthesizers and instruments, it's right up my street, so I definitely had to check it out. I've been using the Noodlebox quite a lot over the past few weeks since I got it, and I wanted to give it a bit of an introduction and explain some of the things that I really like about it. Now, it's far, far too deep for me to give any kind of comprehensive tutorial or anything like that, so think of this more as a kind of, hello, how you doing? A kind of first date sort of thing where you get a feel for each other and see if you might have anything in common. Now, the first thing to talk about is the build quality and the form factor, and to show you just how small this thing is, I've got a Volca sample here that I'll put next to it, and it's basically about the same size as the Volca sample, just slightly shallower and slightly taller, but you get an idea of just how little space the thing takes up. In terms of build quality, the top and bottom are metal. It's a kind of solid metal that reminds me of Eurorack rails or something like that, and the sides are made out of this nice wood, and the whole thing has got quite a good heft to it. You should be aware that the middle panel here is not made out of metal, but it's some kind of hard material, perhaps like PCB material, although I'm not entirely sure. In terms of the buttons and knobs, there's different ways that you interact with the device, but the buttons on the bottom are the really interesting ones for me. When I first looked at them, I wasn't entirely sure how they were going to feel, but actually in practice, they're really nice to use. They've got this kind of thick, heavy, smooth plastic that really reminds me of using old games consoles, which I like a lot. The real gem of this device though is the screen, and I've deliberately left it off for now so that you could see the startup animation when you turn it on, because it really is quite nice. And that's the device. Now, I do have to give you a caveat here, or at least a wee warning, in that I can't really match the refresh rate of the LEDs, so it does look like on the camera that the LEDs are kind of flickering, but in reality they're not. It's just that there are certain limitations with this method of filming, so be aware of that. In person, they're very solid, very nice, and this kind of grid layout with bright blue LEDs is very pleasant indeed. It's quite hard to explain or show you just how good it looks, because in person it really is quite stunning, and I really like the display. Moving on to the connections, we've got a bunch of different things that are all up here on the top. There's none on the side or the top case or anything like that. We've got 9 to 12 volts DC. I'm powering it off just some ripcord thing from MyVolts off of USB, which is great. Now moving across here, you can see that we've got 8 different mini jack outputs. This is for your pitch, CV and gate. So we've got 4 of each. That means that you can essentially sequence 4 synth voices, but we'll come on to talk about that in a minute. Over here, we have MIDI in and output, which is on mini jack, and then we've got sync in and out, and we've got aux in and out. Now, sync in and out can be used for analog sync, and aux in and out is really interesting because this is where you can program it to send out different kinds of control voltages or control pulses. So, for example, a reset pulse or a start pulse or something like that. So, if you want to keep your Eurorack sequences kind of all locked tightly together and reset at the same point, then those are what you use. It is worth noting that even though this is a Eurorack sequencer and it kind of looks like you might be able to mount it in a rack, it is specifically designed to be used standalone, and without modification you can't actually mount it in an actual rack case as far as I'm aware. And that makes a lot of sense to me actually, because tweaking these kinds of sequencers and things at an angle that you would usually have your Eurorack case at is not particularly ergonomic and something that I really don't like doing, but some people like it, so be aware that if you were thinking you could mount this in a Eurorack skiff or whatever, then you can't. It is a standalone device. As if by magic, the Dreadbox Neemfest has now appeared to help me explain the basic workflow of the Noodlebox. Now in here we have 4 different layers which each have 4 separate corresponding pages. Now to help you kind of conceptualize what that means and how they interact or work together, if you think about a layer as corresponding to an individual modular synth voice, and each individual page from that layer corresponding to different sequences or patterns. Now obviously that's just one way of configuring things. I've got another one set up here. I've got MIDI going out from this into my polyphonic synthesizer, but it gives you an idea of the kind of basic approach or fundamental kind of architecture of it. Now to create a very basic sequence, what you do is first select the active step using the encoder. You can see that displayed with the vertical line there. Once you've chosen your active step, you hold down the CV button and turn the encoder to get the note value, which is very helpfully displayed on the right hand side here. Now you can change both the scale and the root note within the settings. So if I hit function and layer, you can see there's a whole bunch of different scales in here. I'm not going to even pretend to know what they all are or really anything about music theory. So I'm just going to leave that default. However, I'm going to change the root note to E, because as my bandmates are fond of telling me, every bit of music I ever write is apparently in the key of E. So why would I change the habit of a lifetime? Now, because I am using MIDI and not CV and gate, then I also have to enable MIDI output for the layer because it isn't on by default. So come out there, go into the layer menu, go down to MIDI output, which I think is down here. At the moment it's at none. Hold down CV again. That's really like a select button a lot of the time. Twist it to the right and we get note. Now you'll see that underneath we now have this option. This is the channel, so channel out. It's on channel 1, which is fine. I would have expected CHL maybe logically, but yeah, whatever. Now I'll go ahead and create just a very basic sequence. Because I'm creating it, I'm sure it will be a work of incredible genius. But let's see, I don't know, do that. Yeah, hit play and we'll hear my masterpiece. Isn't that great? Now we have a variety of different ways that we can manipulate this sequence. So for example, if I go into the layer menu, I can transpose it up an octave. Up a couple of octaves. Oops, I lost the... Up a couple of octaves. Actually, it goes all the way up to 5, and it goes all the way down to 5. However, the Neemfest won't reach those dizzying heights, so we'll just stick with 0. Now, you can also transpose it in semitones, so... which is pretty cool as well. Some of the other ways we can manipulate things are to shift the notes about on the screen. So if I hold down CV and I think random, you can see the vertical come up there, and that means that if I turn encoder, shifted them all up 1, shifted them all up 2, shifted them all up 3, etc, etc. Now the thing about this is it's destructive, so if I let go, it stays at that, whereas, so I'll just bring it back down. Ooh. Whereas if I use the randomize function here, then it does a kind of random shifting of all of the notes. But when I let go, it goes back to the original sequence. So this is pretty cool for on the fly kind of manipulation. And of course, you can also shift them to the right as well, or to the left. on the horizontal plane, which is pretty nice. Now we should talk a wee bit about gates, because the way you can control gates depends on the way you've got this set up. So by default, gates are automatically created when you create a note value, and they also have a kind of standard length. However, you can manually create gates, which gives you a whole load of interesting kind of possibilities for different sounds and interaction with your modular. But when it comes to MIDI, perhaps it's easiest just to demonstrate this with the changing the length of some of the gates. So if I run the sequence again, you'll see down the bottom here we have the gate output or the gate markers running along the bottom. So if I select a step and then I hold down gate, I can change the length of each. Just like that. Very, very easy. Now, each page is made up of a maximum of 32 steps. However, you get a lot of control within that. So you don't have to have a particular division of steps. You could have one page that's running at 11 steps, or maybe 16 or 17. It doesn't have to be a specific number or anything. So if we run the sequence again, I'll show you how you can adjust the kind of length of the sequences on the fly, as it were. To do this, we hold down the loop button, select the point we want the loop to start from, and then we just select the length. And you can see how... And the good thing about this, or one of the interesting things, is that you can do it at any point in the sequence. So you can also reverse it. So let's try going that way. That's an odd value of 12 or something like that. Now, the other cool thing about this is that each layer with its separate pages can have different lengths that are doing different kind of weird looping actions. So if we switch to layer 2, you can see this is blank and it is running at 16 steps and it's going forward. Looking back at layer 1, it's going back the way at some kind of 8 steps, I think. Now on layer 2, I'll set this up for MIDI as well. MIDI output. No, fine. Now if we start to add in a sequence here, change the gate. And then we can start to muck about with the loop on this as well. Anyway, that's not the most musical example in the world, but you get the idea, and you can see how you can start to get this kind of serendipitous sequencing, which is the whole point of this, really. Now, there's a bunch of other interesting things that you can do to spice up your sequences. You can change the probability of each of the steps from actually triggering, so kind of like Electron's trigger locks. You can change the sequence so that it doesn't stick solely to the grid. So for example, if we go in here and we set this option to swing or slide or random, then we can start to offset the notes a bit, so we're not stuck to that kind of overly quantized grid sound, which is particularly nice because that is always a risk when you're using kind of grid or pad sequencers. On top of that, we also have a slew option in here. So if, like me, you're interested in that kind of slidey, glissando, glidey sound that, you know, is so reminiscent of certain generations of music, then you can also do this. You can either apply the slew to every single step or every single note, or you can do it on a ties basis where you go in and manually tie the notes together. And that doesn't work over MIDI, obviously, but it does work very nicely over pitch and gate output. Now, it isn't just notes that this sequencer can output, as I've been shown you so far, you can also use it to control different kinds of control voltages, whether that's through MIDI CC or whether it's through CV. So if we go to a totally different fresh layer, you'll see here, this is layer 4. I've got nothing on there. Inside the layer options, we can change the type of output from pitch to either mod, which is modulation, or offset. And the difference between these two is essentially just that this, I think, is an absolute value, whereas offset is relative to whatever is set on your modular or whatever at that point. Now this is particularly cool because it means you can start sequencing or like sending out control voltage data to things like a filter or, you know, create envelopes and start to get really interesting kind of variations on sequences that all kind of interact together within this box. Now you might be wondering, well, this is a grid, so what happens if you're trying to get a nice smooth filter sweep? Can you do that, or does it just end up all steppy and weird? Well, yeah, you can. You can either have it steppy and have, you know, the individual values clearly defined, or you can set it to interpolate between the values, which means that you don't get that kind of steppy nature, and you can get a nice smooth transition of whatever you want to do. There are a couple of other cool things that are worth mentioning, I guess. You can queue up different sequences of pages to play. So for example, if you wanted sequence 1, or page 1, sorry, and page 3 to play, and then page 4, and then page 2, then you can do that and line them up in that order so that whilst that's going on, you can sit and manipulate all the loops and the ties and the probability and all that other good stuff and not have to worry about manually switching the page. So kind of a song mode, but not really. It's kind of like a chain mode like you might find on a pocket operator. The other really cool feature that I haven't really spent a lot of time looking at because it's very complicated quite quickly is the mix feature, and this allows you to modulate one page from a different page, and you find that in here. And when you bring everything together, it really becomes a very playable kind of, it feels like an instrument that you're interacting with, not just a kind of dead sequence. That, because that's kind of one of my big issues with a lot of sequencers, is you create something and then you just basically trigger the sequences, but this encourages you to get stuck in and change them, manipulate what's going on, and I like that about it a lot. Now, one thing you should note about this sequencer is that it is monophonic, or at least each page is monophonic. So I'm sequencing the allmyfas here, which has got 6 voices, but in order to sequence the different voices, I'm having to use different pages for each of the voices, and this means that you can't really use this to control like a MIDI drum machine where there are multiple notes happening on the device at the same time. And this kind of makes sense, right? Because this is primarily designed to be used with modular Eurorack systems, and in that you couldn't really have multiple notes coming out of a single control voltage output. Like physically it wouldn't make sense. However, it would be pretty amazing if you could do that in here, because then you could have one page dedicated to like a MIDI drum machine and then the other 3 voices dedicated purely to melody lines. And I did email them to ask if this was something they would consider, or, you know, whether that was just way out of scope for this, but I haven't quite heard back yet. Either way, it's amazing for what it is. But you should be aware of that limitation, because I've told a few people about this and they've said, oh great, I could use this for my drum machine. You're like, well, not quite in the way that this is. It's not quite that kind of sequencer. So what do I actually make of the Noodlebox? I guess that's really what the point of this is, because this isn't a tutorial. It's, like I said, the gentle introduction to see if you have anything in common with each other. And I have to say that I really, really love this sequencer. It is just so quick to spin up some really interesting sequences and play about with them live. And like I said, it encourages you to manipulate things. There's so much control in this thing that you don't get in other Eurorack sequencers. And the fact that you get all of this control with all of these features for what is £340 is what I paid for this, then when you compare that to the kind of sequencer you would need to buy in Eurorack land to get those kind of features, then this is actually a bargain. Now, there are a number of button combinations you need to remember to access certain things, and at first I thought that would be quite tricky to remember, but actually it's fairly straightforward, at least for the basic operations. And when you get into things like probability and stuff that require slightly more complicated key presses, then they've handily included this cheat sheet, which I will definitely be keeping nearby, and it's actually very informative. So yeah, it's not as bad in terms of the trying to remember button combinations, etc., as I thought it might be. So ultimately, this is a really pretty powerful Wii sequencer, which does exactly what it sets out to do, which is to provide a way to easily and quickly both sequence and play with those sequences in a live kind of fashion, and it does so very well. I'm really pleased I got this. And if you're in the market for something to sequence your Eurorack that is both kind of esoteric but also powerful, then I would 100% recommend looking into this, because I don't know any other kind of device that gives you this kind of functionality for modular systems with this kind of value. Hopefully, even if this wasn't particularly informative, maybe it was interesting in some way, or perhaps you just like sticking my videos on at night so that my dulcet tones can lull you into a deep and secure sleep. Whatever the case might be, thank you and commiserations for listening and watching this far. If you do have any questions about this, you can always drop them below, along with any comments or suggestions. Maybe you think I look like a particular TV or movie star like Zach Galifianakis, or maybe you want to point out that I talk far too much. Whatever you want to say, please do let me know, because obviously I love and welcome all criticism and comments. For now though, thank you and goodbye.